You think you know Roman depravity. Nero and Caligula are household names. But the darkest chapter of Roman history isn't a well-known story. Imagine a government program that selects children for an elite imperial service. This isn't fiction. Between 27 and 37 AD, Emperor Tiberius enacted this on his private island of Capri. He created a systematic process to acquire young boys, whom he called his minnows. The things they were forced to endure were so horrific that sober historians like Suetonius and Tacitus felt compelled to record them, preserving the truth in the imperial archives. This is not a myth. The archaeological evidence from Tiberius's villa corroborates their accounts. This is a story about the true depths of institutionalized evil, when power is absolute and unaccountable. We'll start with the island prison disguised as paradise, then examine the systematic selection of victims. We'll explore the training program that destroyed children's souls, meet the perpetrator who orchestrated it all, and follow the tragic fate of survivors. We'll uncover attempts to bury this history and finally understand what this reveals about power, complicity, and human nature itself. Each piece of this story builds on the last, creating a complete picture of how institutional evil operates when given unlimited resources and zero accountability. By the end, you'll understand why this story matters not just as history, but as a warning. Let's start with the setting, because location matters when you're orchestrating systematic horror. Capri, today, it's where celebrities vacation, where honeymooners take sunset photos. But 2,000 years ago? This paradise was transformed into something that would make Alcatraz look like a daycare center. The same cliffs that tourists admire today once served as execution sites. The same blue waters that attract swimmers held secrets that would horrify any parent. Tiberius didn't choose Capri for its beauty, he chose it for its isolation, its natural barriers, and its distance from any authority that might question his activities. When an emperor wants to commit unspeakable acts away from public scrutiny, he needs the perfect prison. And Capri, with its single harbor and treacherous cliffs, was absolutely perfect. But here's the truly disturbing part. Villa Jovis wasn't just built as a residence, it was architecturally designed for depravity. We're talking about 7,000 square meters of calculated evil, with specific areas designated for activities that defy human decency. The archaeological evidence shows underground pool networks with temperature control systems, not for comfort, but for specific activities involving those trained little fishes. The Romans were master engineers, and at Villa Jovis, that expertise was perverted into creating spaces where screams couldn't travel, where escape was impossible, and where systematic abuse could occur with clockwork efficiency. The cliff system deserves special attention. These weren't just natural formations. They were incorporated into the villa's design as disposal methods. We're talking about 1,000-foot drops straight into the sea. Historical accounts describe how those who displeased the emperor or tried to escape met their end here. But it gets worse. The positioning of guard posts wasn't just about preventing escape, it was about preventing the victims from choosing their own end. Even death wasn't allowed without imperial permission. Modern analysis of the site shows observation points specifically placed to monitor potential suicide attempts, turning the entire island into a perfectly controlled environment of despair. The acoustic engineering reveals another layer of calculated cruelty. Romans understood sound propagation, and at Villa Jovis, they used this knowledge to create isolation chambers, where no cry for help could penetrate. The pool areas were specifically designed with sound-dampening features, curved walls, specific depths, materials that absorbed rather than reflected sound. What happened in those pools stayed in those pools by design. The engineering genius that built aqueducts and amphitheaters was here applied to creating spaces where children's voices simply disappeared. Now consider the supply chains. This wasn't a temporary setup. This was an ongoing operation requiring constant resources. Ships arrived monthly with fresh supplies, and according to financial records that survived, these weren't just bringing food and wine. They were bringing human cargo. The documentation shows payments for special acquisitions and entertainment procurement. The Romans, masters of logistics, had created a supply chain of horror, with Capri as its endpoint. Guard rotations were scheduled to prevent any individual from developing sympathy. Staff were selected for their loyalty and moral flexibility. Everything was systematized. The underground networks tell their own story. Archaeological excavations revealed a complex system of passages connecting different areas of the villa. But these weren't just servant corridors. The wear patterns, the width calculations, the security features, all point to these being transport routes for moving victims unseen between different areas of the complex. Some passages led to pools, others to private chambers, and disturbingly, some led directly to those clifftop disposal points. The architecture itself was complicit in the horror. Modern architects studying the ruins have noted something chilling. The design prioritized control over comfort. Room layouts prevented privacy. Corridors funneled movement into monitored zones. And even the gardens were arranged to eliminate hiding spots. This wasn't paranoid design. This was predatory architecture. Every element served the dual purpose of enabling abuse while preventing escape or intervention. The beauty of the location became a trap, the isolation, a weapon, and the luxury, a facade hiding systematic evil. Why Capri? The answer lies in its perfect isolation from Roman oversight. 3 hours by boat from the mainland, with treacherous waters preventing unauthorized approach. A single controlled harbour meant every arrival was documented, every departure approved. The natural barriers weren't just physical. They were psychological weapons. Victims knew that even if they escaped the villa, the sea surrounded them. Even if they reached the cliffs, the rocks awaited below. Even if they screamed, only the wind would hear. The island's natural beauty became part of its horror. A paradise transformed into a perfectly designed hell. The perverted genius of using beauty to hide horror extended to every detail. Gorgeous mosaics covered floors where unspeakable acts occurred. Beautiful frescoes decorated walls that witnessed systematic abuse. Marble statues of gods and heroes stood in spaces where childhood innocence was methodically destroyed. This wasn't just cruelty, it was cruelty wrapped in culture, evil dressed in elegance. The contrast between the setting's beauty and its purpose added another layer of psychological torture. How could such terrible things happen in such a beautiful place? That disconnect broke minds as effectively as any physical abuse. Today, you pay $300 a night to stay on Capri. Tourists take selfies, where children once begged for death. Honeymooners swim in waters that once served as a disposal site for broken young bodies. The island has been sanitized by time and tourism, its dark history buried under boutique hotels and designer shops. But the stones remember. The cliffs still drop the same 1,000 feet. The caves still echo with sounds that might be wind, or might be something else. Back then, children paid with their souls just to survive another day. But the location was just the stage. Wait until you hear about the selection process that filled this paradise with victims, turning the Roman administrative machine into a procurement system for imperial depravity. Here's where it gets truly systematic. This wasn't random cruelty. It was organized evil with admission requirements. Imagine if predators didn't have to hide in shadows, but could openly recruit with imperial authority. Imagine if the entire machinery of the state was turned towards supplying victims for one man's perversions. That's exactly what happened under Tiberius. The selection process for his little fishes was as methodical as any military recruitment, as documented as any census, and as ruthless as any imperial taxation. This was institutional predation on a scale that defies modern comprehension. The age requirements were specific and non-negotiable. 8 to 14 years old exclusively. Why these ages? Old enough to follow complex instructions, young enough to be physically overpowered and psychologically broken. Roman documentation shows scouts were given specific criteria, prepubescent but showing signs of approaching physical development, intelligent enough to be trained but young enough to be molded. The precision is chilling. This wasn't opportunistic abuse. This was calculated selection based on psychological profiles that wouldn't be out of place in a modern criminal profiling manual. But it gets worse. The physical tests were as specific as they were disturbing. 2-minute breath-holding minimum became a standard requirement. Swimming ability wasn't just preferred, it was mandatory. Children were tested in pools, their lung capacity measured, their underwater agility assessed. Why? Because Tiberius's specific perversions involved aquatic activities where his victims needed to perform as little fishes, a term that becomes more horrifying the more you understand its implications. Those who couldn't hold their breath long enough were rejected. Those who showed fear of water were dismissed. Only those who could function underwater for extended periods made the cut. The intelligence screening adds another layer of calculated evil. These children weren't selected randomly. They were chosen for their ability to learn complex behaviors. Reading ability was tested. Memory skills were evaluated. Problem-solving capabilities were assessed. Why? Because being a little fish involved more than just swimming. It involved learning specific movements, remembering complex sequences, understanding, and obeying increasingly disturbing commands. The smarter the child, the more valuable they became. Intelligence, usually a blessing, became a curse that marked children for selection. Geographic targeting reveals the systemic nature of this horror. Coastal communities were hit hardest. Fishing villages where children naturally learned to swim young, port towns where poverty made families desperate. Island communities where strong lungs were survival traits. Roman records show certain regions faced regular tributes of children, quotas that had to be filled. Local administrators who failed to provide suitable candidates faced punishment. Those who exceeded quotas received rewards. The empire's vast bureaucracy, designed to maintain order and collect taxes, was repurposed into a child procurement network. The documentation systems are perhaps the most chilling evidence of all. These weren't shadowy kidnappings. These were recorded transactions. Names, ages, physical descriptions, family backgrounds, test results, all carefully documented in official records. Some of these documents survived, providing horrifying glimpses into the bureaucracy of abuse. Children were assigned identification numbers, their progress tracked, their performance evaluated. The same administrative efficiency that built roads and aqueducts was applied to destroying childhoods. Forms were filled, stamps applied, records filed. Evil wore the mask of proper procedure. Recruitment incentives turned poverty into a weapon. Families were offered coin, grain allotments, tax relief. For desperate parents with multiple children, sacrificing one to save the others became a devil's bargain. But here's the truly insidious part. Families were told their children were being honored, selected for imperial service, given opportunities they'd never have in fishing villages. Some parents genuinely believed they were providing a better life. Others knew but chose survival over conscience. The documentation shows payment records, signed contracts, official seals. Parents literally sold their children to the state, and the state delivered them to the architect of their destruction. Family pressures went beyond simple poverty. Local officials could make life impossible for families who refused to comply. Fishing licenses revoked, market stall permits denied. Tax assessments mysteriously increased. The message was clear: cooperate or suffer. Some families fled, abandoning ancestral homes rather than sacrifice their children. Others hid their children, claiming they had died or been lost at sea. But the empire's reach was long, its memory longer. Census records were checked, neighbors questioned, rewards offered for information. The selection system created a culture of fear where parents viewed their own children's abilities as potential curses. Roman administrative efficiency, usually a source of imperial pride, became a tool of systematic abuse. The same systems that delivered grain to distant provinces now delivered children to Capri. The same communication networks that carried military orders now carried selection criteria. The same financial controls that prevented corruption now tracked payment for victims. Every strength of Roman organization was perverted into serving one man's depravity. Regional governors competed to fill quotas. Local administrators maintained waiting lists. The machinery of empire ground on, processing children like any other resource. The psychological profile of selected victims reveals careful consideration of breaking points. Children who showed strong family bonds were preferred. Their homesickness could be weaponized. Those who displayed natural trust in authority were valued. Their innocence made them easier to manipulate. Physical beauty was noted, but wasn't primary. Functionality mattered more than appearance. Strong swimmers who showed fearlessness in water were prized above all. The selection criteria read like a predator's shopping list, each trait chosen for how it could be exploited. We worry about online predators grooming one child at a time. Tiberius had the entire Roman bureaucracy recruiting for him. Modern child protection systems struggle to track known offenders. Rome created an official pipeline from countryside to Capri. Today's parents fear strangers in playgrounds. Roman parents feared census takers with swimming tests. The scale is what makes this uniquely horrifying. This wasn't one criminal operating in shadows. This was an empire repurposed for abuse. But selection was just the beginning. The real nightmare started with training. What happened to these carefully chosen children once they reached Capri defies belief. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The systematic destruction of innocence was about to begin. This is where humanity hits rock bottom. These children weren't just abused. They were systematically programmed to participate in their own destruction. The term little fishes wasn't metaphorical. It described a specific training regimen that transformed terrified children into aquatic performers for the emperor's twisted pleasures. What you're about to learn will challenge your faith in human nature, because it shows how methodically innocence can be destroyed when power operates without conscience. The training program at Villa Jovis wasn't just abuse. It was abuse elevated to an art form, systematized into a curriculum of horror. The daily schedule began before dawn. Children were woken in darkness, given minimal food. Enough to function, but not enough to have energy for resistance. Then came the pools. Hours upon hours in specially designed pools where water, temperature, depth, and current were carefully controlled. But these weren't swimming lessons. The children were trained to perform specific underwater movements, to approach the emperor in particular ways, to respond to coded commands. They learned to be little fishes, darting, swimming, performing actions that served Tiberius's specific desires while he bathed. The exact nature of these actions is best left to imagination, but historical accounts make clear they were designed to simulate and stimulate in ways that destroyed childhood innocence. The terminology itself reveals the depth of psychological manipulation. Little fishes, playful, almost innocent sounding. Children were told they were special, chosen, privileged to serve the emperor in unique ways. The language masked horror with whimsy, making the unspeakable seem almost normal. New arrivals were shown older children who had adapted, who performed their roles with apparent willingness. The message was clear. This is normal here. This is what good little fishes do. The corruption of language became a tool of control, turning natural childhood playfulness into something nightmarish. But here's the truly disturbing part: the reward systems. Children who performed well received better food, warmer sleeping quarters, small privileges. Those who excelled might get a day of rest, a sweet treat, a softer bed. These rewards weren't kindnesses, they were psychological weapons. They created a perverted economy where children competed to please their abuser, where victim status became hierarchical, where survival meant becoming complicit in your own abuse. The documentation shows careful tracking of which rewards motivated which children, a scientific approach to manipulation that would make modern behavioral psychologists sick. Punishment protocols reveal equal calculation. Physical punishment was rare. Damaged goods served no purpose. Instead, isolation, food restriction, removal of earned privileges, watching other children receive rewards while you went hungry, being excluded from the games and forced to observe, knowing that non-participation meant starvation. The punishments were designed not just to compel compliance, but to make children want to participate, to see abuse as preferable to exclusion. The psychology is so twisted it's hard to comprehend. Yet the evidence shows this system functioned with horrifying efficiency. Senior victims training newcomers represents perhaps the darkest aspect of the program. Children who had been there longer were required to mentor new arrivals, to demonstrate techniques, to share wisdom about pleasing the emperor. This wasn't just practical training. It was psychological warfare. It normalized the abuse, made it seem survivable, even masterable. New children saw older ones who had adapted, who seemed almost comfortable in their roles. The message was clear. You too can survive this if you just accept it. The cycle of abuse became self-perpetuating, with victims creating new victims. The psychological conditioning went beyond simple training. Children were given new names, their fish names, severing connections to their previous identities. They were taught that their families had sold them, that no one was looking for them, that their only value lay in their performance. Group activities created trauma bonds between victims, making them dependent on each other for emotional survival, while simultaneously making them complicit in each other's abuse. The program created a closed ecosystem of horror, where normal human responses were systematically eliminated. Physical modifications add another layer of horror to this already nightmarish picture. Children's hair was cut in specific styles to reduce water resistance. Their nails were kept at precise lengths for optimal swimming. Some accounts suggest more invasive modifications, though the details are mercifully vague in historical records. What's clear is that these children's bodies were treated as tools to be optimized for their aquatic performances. The physical training pushed bodies to their limits. Lung capacity expanded through forced practice. Flexibility increased through repetitive positioning. Endurance built through hours of daily pool time. The systematic nature of the training reveals careful planning. Different children were trained for different roles, some as active performers, others as living decorations, some as servants who happened to swim. The specialization shows this wasn't impulsive cruelty, but a thought-out system with defined positions and career paths. Children could advance from basic roles to more complex ones, creating a perverted sense of achievement. Success in abuse became a survival skill. Excellence in degradation, a source of twisted pride. Modern psychology has terms for this: trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome. But those terms feel inadequate when describing children trained to see their abuse as an accomplishment. What happened at Villa Jovis went beyond creating victims. It created participants who believed their participation was normal, even praiseworthy. The training program didn't just break bodies, it rebuilt minds, creating human beings who could function only within the system that destroyed them. These children learned to find safety in compliance, comfort in routine abuse, identity in their degradation. The evidence for this training program comes from multiple sources. Suetonius provides details that match archaeological findings, pool modifications that only make sense for the activities described. Financial records show purchases of specific equipment, hiring of trainers with aquatic expertise, medical supplies for treating water-related injuries. Contemporary accounts describe seeing these performances, though most observers were too horrified or complicit to document details. What emerges is a picture of systematic evil that operated openly, with infrastructure, staff, and budget lines. Modern psychology has terms for this: trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome. But those terms feel inadequate when describing children trained to see their abuse as an accomplishment. The damage done wasn't just physical or even sexual, it was existential. These children had their very humanity systematically deconstructed and rebuilt to serve one man's perversions. They became living proof that with enough power, patience, and cruelty, you can transform human beings into anything. Speaking of that man, let's talk about the emperor himself, the architect of this systematic horror. who turned absolute power into an instrument of absolute corruption. Every horror story needs its architect. Tiberius wasn't born evil. He was made by power, aged by paranoia, and rotted by absolute authority. Understanding him doesn't excuse his actions, but it does reveal how human beings can transform into something inhuman when given unlimited power and zero accountability. This is the story of how a celebrated military commander became history's most systematic child abuser. How a man who once protected Rome's borders came to violate its most fundamental values. The transformation of Tiberius from hero to perpetrator is a case study in how power corrupts not just politically but personally, turning authority into atrocity. Tiberius in his 70s was a walking contradiction, supreme power housed in a failing body. Multiple health conditions plagued him. Skin eruptions that oozed and stank, breathing problems that left him gasping, joint pain that made movement agony. Contemporary accounts describe a man whose body was betraying him, even as his power remained absolute. But instead of accepting physical decline with grace, he raged against it through increasingly depraved acts. The little fishes weren't just victims of lust. They were props in an old man's desperate denial of mortality. Their youth and vitality became cruel mirrors, reflecting what he had lost. The physical deterioration went beyond normal aging. Romans described facial sores that refused to heal, a body odor that perfumes couldn't mask, tremors that betrayed weakness he couldn't admit. Some historians suggest these symptoms indicate tertiary syphilis. Others point to psychological manifestations of guilt. Whatever the cause, Tiberius's body became a prison of decay that drove him to seek increasingly extreme sensations. The pools weren't just for pleasure. The water soothed his ravaged skin. The children's smooth bodies contrasted with his corruption. Every abuse was partly an attempt to feel something through nerves deadened by disease and age. His psychological profile reads like a textbook in paranoid personality disorder. Years of political intrigue had taught him to trust no one. Isolation on Capri intensified these tendencies until conspiracy theories consumed him. He saw enemies everywhere, in the Senate, among his guards, even in the stars. Astrologers were executed for unfavorable predictions. Messengers were killed for bringing bad news. In this atmosphere of total paranoia, only the completely powerless were safe companions. Children couldn't threaten him, couldn't plot against him, couldn't judge him. Their helplessness made them the only humans he could relax around, though relax meant something nightmarish in his vocabulary. The contrast with his earlier life makes the transformation more horrifying. This was the same Tiberius who had led Roman legions to victory in Germania, who had been hailed as a military genius, who had once embodied Roman virtues of discipline and duty. Young Tiberius had been known for his austere lifestyle, his dedication to service, his tactical brilliance. Soldiers had followed him into battle believing in his honor. The path from that commander to the architect of Capri's horror shows how power without purpose becomes perversion. When external challenges disappeared, when enemies were defeated, when there was nothing left to conquer, he turned his need for domination inward, onto the most vulnerable. Daily routines at Villa Jovis mixed governance with abuse in ways that normalized horror. Morning briefings on imperial business were followed by pool sessions with the little fishes. State documents were signed between acts of depravity. Foreign ambassadors were received in rooms that hours earlier had witnessed unspeakable acts. This wasn't a man who abandoned duty for pleasure. This was someone who integrated atrocity into administration. The empire continued to function because Tiberius remained competent in matters of state, even as he descended into personal depravity. This competence made him more dangerous. A functional perpetrator is harder to stop than a chaotic one. Public image versus private reality created a schizophrenic existence. To most of the empire, Tiberius remained the stern but capable emperor who maintained peace and prosperity. Official portraits showed a dignified elder statesman. Public pronouncements emphasized justice and tradition. Meanwhile, on Capri, children screamed in pools, while their emperor found pleasure in their terror. The disconnect between image and reality wasn't accidental, it was carefully maintained. Those who knew the truth were either complicit or terrified. Those who didn't know lived under an illusion of normal governance. The facade held because everyone who mattered had reasons to maintain it. Contemporary accounts from witnesses brave or foolish enough to record truth paint a picture of calculated cruelty. Tiberius didn't just abuse children, he innovated new forms of abuse. He held competitions between victims, forcing them to perform increasingly degrading acts for rewards. He created elaborate scenarios where children played mythological roles in perverted recreations of legends. He documented his activities, keeping records of which children performed which acts, rating their responses, noting their breaking points. This wasn't impulsive violence, it was cruelty as hobby, evil as entertainment, abuse as art form. The role of isolation in escalating depravity cannot be understated. On Capri, removed from any moderating influences, Tiberius created a reality where his desires were the only law, surrounded by enablers and terrified servants, hearing no dissenting voices, seeing no disapproving faces. He lost all connection to normal human morality. The island became a psychological echo chamber where each atrocity made the next easier, where boundaries dissolved in the absence of anyone to enforce them. Absolute power combined with absolute isolation created absolute corruption. But perhaps most revealing is how aging intensified, rather than mellowed his cruelty. As death approached, the aging tyrant seemed determined to extract every possible sensation from life, no matter the cost to others. The Little Fishes program expanded in his final years. The acts became more extreme, the victims younger. It was as if he believed that enough innocent suffering could somehow restore his own lost vitality. Each child destroyed was a futile rage against his own mortality. Each young life ruined a pathetic attempt to steal time from death. We see powerful men's scandals exposed by journalism today. In Rome, the scandal was an open secret, protected by imperial power. Everyone who mattered knew about Capri. Senators whispered about it in private. Historians documented it carefully. Guards who served there returned traumatized. But knowledge without power to act is just complicity with extra steps. The Roman system that had created checks and balances, that had once prided itself on republican virtues, had evolved into something that could know about systematic child abuse and do absolutely nothing. The architect of horror wasn't just Tiberius. It was the entire structure that enabled him. The emperor died in 37 AD, smothered by his successor according to some accounts, or simply expired from his various ailments according to others. His death was celebrated throughout the empire, with crowds chanting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius." But even emperors die, and when Tiberius did, the aftermath was almost as tragic as the crime. The system that had created victims didn't suddenly develop compassion for survivors. The children trained as little fishes faced a world that had no place for them, no understanding of what they'd endured, no framework for helping them heal. Their story, the story of what happened after the perpetrator died, might be the most heartbreaking chapter of all. You might think death in 37 AD ended the nightmare. For survivors, it was just the beginning of a different kind of torment. When news of Tiberius's death reached Capri, the immediate reaction wasn't celebration but confusion. These children, some who had known no other life than the villa's horror, suddenly faced a world they weren't prepared for. The little fishes who had survived years of systematic abuse now had to survive something potentially worse. Freedom without resources, memories without therapy, trauma without treatment. What happened to these children after their abuser's death reveals truths about human resilience and societal failure that echo across centuries. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Boys who had been kept in careful routines suddenly had no structure. Children trained to respond to specific commands found themselves in a world where those commands meant nothing. Some historical accounts describe them wandering the villa grounds, waiting for instructions that never came, returning to pools out of habit rather than compulsion. The guards and staff, knowing their own complicity, fled quickly, leaving behind dozens of traumatized children with no food, no guidance, and no idea what normal life looked like. Some starved before anyone thought to help them. Others drowned in the same pools where they'd been abused. Whether by accident or design remains unclear. Physical damage was just the beginning of their problems. Years of specialized abuse had left bodies broken in specific ways. Malnutrition, from controlled diets, left them weak and prone to disease. Lung damage from excessive underwater training made breathing difficult. Some had injuries that never properly healed. Joints damaged from forced positions. Internal injuries from acts best left undescribed. But Roman medicine had no framework for treating abuse victims. Doctors who examined survivors treated symptoms without understanding causes. Broken bones could be set, but broken spirits were beyond their expertise. The psychological destruction defied contemporary understanding. These children exhibited behaviors Rome had no words for. Trauma responses we now recognize as PTSD, dissociative disorders, anxiety conditions. They couldn't sleep without nightmares. They couldn't bathe without panic. Some continued performing their trained behaviors compulsively, swimming in circles, holding their breath until they passed out. Others sat in catatonic silence. Minds retreated so far from reality that no words could reach them. Roman society, which prized stoic endurance, had no patience for such visible brokenness. These weren't wounded warriors deserving honor. They were embarrassing reminders of imperial shame. Family rejection added another layer of tragedy. Parents who had sold or surrendered their children couldn't face what had been done. Some families had moved on, had new children, had built lives around the absence. When broken teenagers appeared at doors they'd left as children, many weren't welcomed home. How could parents look at children they'd failed to protect? How could families integrate survivors whose experiences were literally unspeakable? Some parents blamed the children themselves, easier than accepting their own complicity. Others simply refused to believe, insisting their children had died years ago, rather than accepting the damaged strangers who claimed their names. Social ostracization was inevitable in a culture that blamed victims for their victimization. These children were marked forever by their past. Everyone knew where they'd been, what had been done to them, what they'd been forced to do. Marriage prospects were non-existent. Employment opportunities were limited to the lowest rungs of society. They were seen as contaminated. Their very presence a reminder of things decent Romans preferred to forget. Some tried to hide their past, moving to distant provinces, creating new identities. But trauma has ways of revealing itself, and their behaviors marked them as surely as any brand. The suicide rates among survivors tell their own horrible story. Historical records, sparse as they are on this topic, suggest that most little fishes didn't survive long after Capri. Some took their own lives quickly, finally free to choose the death they'd been denied on the island. Others died slowly. Alcohol, dangerous living, gradual self-destruction. A few accounts describe survivors returning to Capri years later, drawn back to the site of their trauma, throwing themselves from the same cliffs they'd once been threatened with. The island that had stolen their childhoods claimed their adulthoods too. But perhaps most heartbreaking were the few who tried to speak out. In a world before psychology, before trauma theory, before any understanding of systematic abuse, their words fell on deaf ears. Who would believe such stories? Who wanted to hear them? Some survivors tried to petition for justice, for acknowledgement, for simple recognition of what had been done. They were dismissed as madmen, attention seekers, liars trying to profit from imperial death. The Roman legal system had no framework for prosecuting the dead, no concept of institutional liability, no mechanism for compensating victims. Justice was as impossible as healing. The documented cases we have are heartbreaking in their simplicity. Marcus, aged 16 at liberation, found work at the docks but couldn't stand being near water. He died in a street fight 2 years later. Quintus, who'd been at Capri longest, never spoke again after Tiberius died, spending his remaining years in silent service at a temple. Gaius tried to return to his fishing village but was driven out by neighbors who feared contamination. These aren't just names, they're human beings whose entire existence was shaped by systematic evil, then abandoned by the society that had enabled their abuse. Today we have therapy, support groups, justice systems. These children had nothing but memories and scars. They carried trauma that had no name, suffered from conditions that wouldn't be understood for 2 millennia. They were the first documented survivors of systematic institutional abuse. But their survival was barely life at all. Some found refuge in religions that promised better afterlives. Others disappeared into the urban masses of Rome, anonymous in their suffering. A precious few might have found some measure of peace, though historical records give us no such comfort. The long-term impacts on communities rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown in still water. Coastal villages that had lost children to the selection system were forever changed. Parents who had surrendered children carried guilt that poisoned families for generations. Siblings grew up knowing they'd been spared while brothers were sacrificed. The social fabric of entire regions was damaged by complicity in horror. Trust in authority, once broken, never fully healed. These communities learned that imperial power could reach into their homes, take their children, and face no consequences. That lesson shaped political attitudes for generations. But perhaps most disturbing is how this story was nearly buried, how subsequent generations tried to minimize or deny what happened. The survivors' testimonies were discredited, their experiences relegated to rumor and legend. Official histories glossed over Capri, focusing on Tiberius's military victories and administrative competence. The little fishes became footnotes in larger narratives, their suffering reduced to salacious details in gossipy accounts. It would take centuries before historians began treating their stories as legitimate testimony rather than sensationalist fiction. Even now, some scholars attempt to minimize what happened, to explain it away, to protect the reputation of classical civilization from its darkest truths. For centuries, historians tried to dismiss this as propaganda. Even now, some scholars attempt to minimize what happened. Here's why they're wrong, and why the evidence for Tiberius's crimes is actually stronger than for many accepted historical events. The attempt to bury or discredit this history reveals how power protects power across centuries, how academic respectability can become complicity, and how the victimization of children is often the first thing erased from official records. Understanding these cover-up attempts isn't just about defending historical truth, it's about recognizing patterns that repeat whenever powerful institutions face accusations of systematic abuse. Suetonius's documentation provides our most detailed account, and his credibility is crucial to establish. This wasn't some gossip monger or political opponent. Suetonius served as secretary to Emperor Hadrian, with direct access to imperial archives. He wrote decades after Tiberius's death, when there was no political gain in defaming a long-dead emperor. His accounts of other emperors are considered reliable by the same historians who question his Tiberius narrative. The selective skepticism is telling. When Suetonius describes Nero's architectural projects or Claudius's public works, he's a trusted source. When he documents child abuse, suddenly, he's unreliable. This isn't historical criticism, it's motivated reasoning. Multiple source corroboration strengthens the case beyond reasonable doubt. Tacitus, writing independently, confirms the essential details while adding his own observations. Cassius Dio, working from different sources, provides matching accounts. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary Jewish philosopher, references the scandals of Capri in his works. These aren't writers copying each other, they're independent witnesses to historical truth. The convergence of their accounts, despite different perspectives and agendas, creates a body of evidence that would convict in any court. Yet some historians demand a level of proof for child abuse that they don't require for military campaigns or political intrigue. Archaeological evidence at Villa Jovis provides physical confirmation of written accounts. The pool modifications discovered during excavations match exactly what would be needed for the activities Suetonius describes. Hidden passages, observation points, architectural features designed for control and containment all support the historical narrative. You can dismiss written accounts as exaggeration, but you can't dismiss stone and mortar. The villa's design speaks louder than any ancient text, telling a story of systematic planning for systematic abuse. Modern archaeological techniques have only strengthened this evidence, revealing details that confirm the worst suspicions. Contemporary accounts from witnesses add another layer of verification. Letters from senators who visited Capri, reports from guards who served there, observations from merchants who supplied the island, all paint a consistent picture. These weren't coordinated testimonies but independent observations that align in disturbing ways. The fact that many witnesses were clearly uncomfortable with what they saw, that they wrote in euphemisms and hints rather than explicit detail, actually strengthens their credibility. People don't write cautiously about fiction, they write cautiously about dangerous truths. Financial records provide perhaps the most damning evidence. You can debate motivations and interpretations, but you can't debate accounting ledgers. The payments for special acquisitions, the budget lines for aquatic instructors, the medical expenses for treating specific types of injuries, these create a paper trail of atrocity. The Roman bureaucracy's obsessive record-keeping became evidence of its own complicity. Some historians argue these records could refer to innocent activities. But when you combine financial documentation with architectural evidence and multiple testimonies, innocent explanations evaporate. Later emperors referencing the scandal shows it was accepted history even in ancient times. Caligula, despite his own depravities, publicly criticized Tiberius's actions on Capri. Claudius ordered certain areas of Villa Jovis destroyed, suggesting shame about what had occurred there. These weren't distant historians making claims. These were immediate successors dealing with recent history. Their actions and statements show that Tiberius's crimes were understood and acknowledged by those in position to know the truth. The shame was real, immediate, and acted upon. Modern attempts at historical revision follow predictable patterns. Some scholars argue the accounts are exaggerated, that ancient historians were prone to sensationalism. Others suggest political motivations, claiming Tiberius's enemies invented stories to discredit him. More insidiously, some frame the abuse in cultural relativist terms, suggesting we can't judge ancient practices by modern standards. These arguments fall apart under scrutiny. The same historians who documented these crimes showed restraint in other areas, demonstrated political neutrality in other accounts, and made clear that even by Roman standards, Tiberius's actions were abhorrent. Why powerful people protect powerful predators across centuries requires examination. Academic historians often come from privileged backgrounds, move in elite circles, understand power from the inside. Acknowledging that someone of Tiberius's status and education could commit such crimes threatens their worldview. It's more comfortable to believe in propaganda than in systematic evil by educated elites. This protection isn't usually conscious. It's the subtle bias of those who can't imagine their peers capable of such acts. But this bias has consequences, silencing victims across millennia. The politics of historical interpretation play a crucial role in these cover-ups. Classics departments need funding, museums need donors, academic careers need respectability. It's easier to focus on Roman achievements than Roman atrocities. Every historian who minimizes Tiberius's crimes makes a calculated choice. Truth versus comfort, victims versus reputation, honesty versus career advancement. The pressure to present classical civilization in positive terms creates incentive to downplay its darkest chapters. But sanitizing history serves no one except those who would repeat it. How academic language sanitizes atrocity deserves special attention. Read scholarly articles about Capri, and you'll find euphemisms that obscure rather than illuminate. Sexual irregularities instead of the systematic sexual abuse of children. Alternative behaviors instead of systematic abuse. Historical allegations instead of documented crimes. This language isn't neutral. It's protective, wrapping horror in verbal gauze until it seems almost acceptable. The same academics who write clearly about military violence become suddenly circumspect when discussing sexual violence against children. The inconsistency reveals priorities. The importance of believing victims, even ancient ones, extends beyond historical accuracy. Every time we dismiss documented abuse because it's uncomfortable, we send a message to modern victims. Every historical cover-up enables contemporary ones. The patterns of minimization, victim blaming, and institutional protection that shielded Tiberius operate today in different forms. When we refuse to acknowledge historical truth about abuse, we participate in cultures of silence that enable ongoing abuse. The little fishes deserve better than scholarly skepticism. They deserve recognition, acknowledgement, and justice, even if it comes 2,000 years too late. We like to think we're better at facing hard truths now. But if modern scandals teach us anything, it's that power still protects power. Institutions still prioritize reputation over victims. Scholars still find reasons to doubt testimonies that threaten established narratives. The cover-up of Tiberius's crimes isn't ancient history. It's a continuing process every time someone minimizes, contextualizes, or explains away what happened on Capri. Speaking of patterns, let's examine what this reveals about human nature and the systems we create, because understanding these patterns might be our only defense against their repetition. This wasn't just about one evil emperor. This was about a system that enabled him, protected him, and supplied him with victims. The horror of Capri reveals patterns that transcend time and culture. Patterns we see repeated wherever absolute power meets institutional protection. Understanding these patterns isn't about dwelling on ancient atrocities, but about recognizing the warning signs in our own institutions. Every generation believes it's immune to systematic evil, that its safeguards are stronger, its morality more developed. Every generation is wrong. The little fishes of Capri have modern equivalents, and pretending otherwise is dangerous naivety. Complicit administrators and guards formed the first circle of enablement. These weren't evil people themselves. They were ordinary individuals who chose compliance over conscience. The accountants who processed payments for children knew what those payments meant. The guards who prevented escapes understood what they were enabling. The servants who prepared pools and cleaned up afterward couldn't pretend ignorance. Yet they all participated. Some for money, some from fear, some because following orders was easier than refusing them. Each individual could rationalize their small part. I just keep the books. I just guard the door. I just maintain the pools. But systematic evil requires systematic support, and every small compliance adds up to enormous horror. Economic incentives for participation created a corruption economy around abuse. Guards at Capri earned triple standard wages. Administrators who managed the selection process received bonuses. Local officials who met quotas got promoted. Even the boatmen who transported victims were paid premium rates for their silence. The Roman economic system, based on patronage and payment, was perfectly designed to purchase complicity. When abuse becomes profitable, when silence pays better than speech, when participation offers advancement while resistance guarantees destruction, most people make predictable choices. The economics of evil are depressingly simple. Make compliance rewarding and resistance costly. Social structures enabling abuse went beyond individual choices. Roman society was built on hierarchy, on unquestioned authority, on the assumption that superiors knew best. Children were property, their bodies belonging to fathers who could sell them, masters who could use them, emperors who could destroy them. The concept of childhood innocence as something requiring protection didn't exist. This wasn't moral failure. It was moral absence. A society that hadn't developed concepts we take for granted. When social structures don't recognize certain humans as fully human, their abuse becomes not just possible but inevitable. Similar patterns in other periods show this isn't uniquely Roman. Medieval monasteries with unchecked authority over children. colonial schools where indigenous youth faced systematic abuse, modern institutions where powerful men controlled vulnerable populations. The settings change, the justifications evolve, but the pattern remains consistent. Isolation plus authority plus vulnerable populations equals abuse. It's mathematical in its predictability, yet we're repeatedly surprised when scandals emerge, as if each instance were an anomaly rather than an inevitability given the conditions. The role of isolation and absolute authority cannot be overstated. Capri worked as a site of horror because it was removed from oversight. But isolation isn't always geographic. It can be institutional, boarding schools, detention centers, any place where outside eyes can't see. It can be social, communities that handle problems internally, professions that protect their own. It can be psychological, creating environments where victims don't believe they'll be heard. Wherever authority operates without accountability, wherever power exists without oversight, the potential for Capri-like horror exists. How systematic abuse requires systematic support is perhaps the hardest lesson. One person, no matter how powerful, cannot create large-scale horror alone. Tiberius needed administrators to organize selection, guards to maintain control, servants to enable activities, accountants to hide expenses, boats to transport victims, suppliers to provide resources. Each participant could claim limited knowledge, minimal involvement, just following orders. But systematic abuse is like a machine. Remove any component, and it fails. The tragedy is how many components choose to keep functioning rather than risk the consequences of resistance. Warning signs ignored or suppressed follow predictable patterns. There are always early indicators, unusual financial transactions, behavioral changes in victims, whispered concerns among staff. But these signs are explained away, rationalized, or actively silenced. Those who speak up face consequences, while those who stay quiet get rewarded. Investigation becomes more dangerous than ignorance. Over time, willful blindness becomes actual blindness. People stop seeing what they've trained themselves not to notice. The warning signs don't disappear. We just become expert at not recognizing them. Every generation thinks it's immune to this kind of systematic evil. We have laws now, we say. We have child protection services, mandatory reporting, background checks. We have awareness campaigns and hotlines and therapeutic interventions. All true, all important, all insufficient when power concentrates and oversight weakens. Modern scandals, from churches to schools to entertainment industries, show how easily our safeguards fail when institutions prioritize reputation over protection. The tools change, but the patterns remain, and recognizing these patterns is the first step in breaking them. Universal patterns of institutional abuse transcend time and culture. The grooming process that selects vulnerable victims, the gradual normalization of inappropriate behavior, the creation of complicit networks that benefit from silence, the discrediting of victims who speak out, the protection of perpetrators who hold power. These patterns appear whether we're examining ancient Rome or modern institutions. They're not anomalies. They're predictable outcomes when certain conditions align. Understanding these patterns doesn't guarantee prevention, but ignorance guarantees repetition. Why good people become complicit is perhaps the most important lesson from Capri. The administrators, guards, and servants weren't recruited from some special pool of evil humans. They were ordinary Romans who faced extraordinary moral tests and failed. They had families to feed, careers to protect, lives to live. Resistance meant sacrifice most weren't prepared to make. This isn't excuse, but explanation. Understanding how ordinary people become enablers of horror helps us recognize our own vulnerability to complicity. We all like to believe we'd be the guard who refused orders, the administrator who exposed the truth. Statistics suggest otherwise. The architecture of systematic evil is built from ordinary components arranged in extraordinary ways. Take normal human hierarchies, add concentrated power, remove oversight, introduce vulnerable populations, create economic incentives for compliance, establish social structures that dehumanize victims, ensure geographic or institutional isolation, and systematic abuse becomes almost inevitable. It's not that humans are inherently evil, it's that certain structures bring out the worst in ordinary people while empowering the truly evil. Recognizing these structures is essential for preventing their construction. Every generation thinks it's immune to this kind of systematic evil. Every generation is wrong. But understanding these patterns might be our only defense. When we see authority concentrating, oversight weakening, vulnerable populations isolated, economic incentives misaligned, social structures dehumanizing, we should hear echoes of Capri, not because every institution will become a site of horror, but because any institution can, if we're not vigilant. The little fishes didn't die just as victims of one emperor's depravity. They died as casualties of systems that enabled, protected, and perpetuated abuse. Honor their memory by recognizing those systems when they emerge in modern forms. Remember when I said this would make you question everything about ancient civilization? Now you understand. This wasn't barbarism. It was sophisticated evil. It wasn't chaos. It was system. It wasn't one evil person. It was an entire structure that enabled horror. Those little fishes Tiberius trained represent something darker than individual cruelty. They represent what happens when absolute power meets bureaucratic efficiency, when paradise becomes prison, when children become currency in games of domination. The pools of Capri have dried up, but the patterns that filled them with victims persist. Every element of this horror, the selection process, the training program, the institutional complicity, the aftermath of abandonment, reveals truths about power and vulnerability that transcend time and culture. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Given enough power and isolation, given systems that prioritize authority over humanity, given societies that silence victims, these horrors don't stay in the past. They reproduce themselves in new forms, with new justifications, in every era that forgets their lessons. The pools of Capri might be ruins, but the patterns that filled them with victims persist wherever power operates in darkness. Modern institutions that concentrate authority, isolate vulnerable populations, and operate without transparency carry the seeds of similar atrocities. Not because they're staffed by evil people, but because they're staffed by humans operating within structures that can transform ordinary people into enablers of evil. Next time you complain about government oversight, remember what happens without it. Next time you dismiss ancient peoples as primitive, remember they had the sophistication to document their own society's failures. And next time you think modern times are uniquely corrupt, remember that we at least try to protect children instead of systematically destroying them. We live in an imperfect world, but it's paradise compared to Capri under Tiberius. Our institutions fail, but they fail while attempting protection rather than enabling predation. Our powerful face consequences, however insufficient, rather than operating with impunity. Our victims have voices, however muted, rather than being silenced by death or disbelief. Progress is real, even if incomplete. If this video disturbed you, good. It should. Share it not for shock value, but for awareness. Subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge comfortable narratives. Comment with your thoughts on power and accountability. Until next time, remember, those who forget history's horrors are doomed to enable their return.